The storm hit without warning, fierce winds and snow burying everything in its path. You didn't expect to survive the blizzard of '78, but there was one thing that could keep your horses alive: a secret tunnel hidden under the snow, packed tight with hay, and built in the dead of night. But no one ever thought you'd make it through, not even you. Before we head into the storm, saddle up and tell us where you're listening from, and if frontier survival stories speak to you, ride on and join us for tomorrow's tale. Thomas Erickson stood on the edge of his homestead, looking out across the wide open prairie. The snow was already starting to fall, small flakes that danced in the early wind. It was only the middle of October, but something about the stillness in the air made him feel uneasy. He had seen plenty of winters in his time, but he knew better than most that you couldn't predict what kind of storm might be coming. The ranch was quiet, the only sound the wind, as it stirred the leaves on the few trees near his cabin. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. For most people, the beginning of winter meant the hard work of cutting firewood and preparing for the cold. But for Thomas, it was different. He wasn't just getting ready for another season, he was preparing for something far worse. He didn't know exactly what it would be, but he knew the signs. The wind, the way the birds had stopped flying south earlier than usual, the way the clouds had gathered in a thick gray blanket across the sky, they all pointed to a fierce storm. Thomas had lived in Dakota Territory long enough to understand that winter out here could be unforgiving. And for most of the settlers, that meant building a small cabin, stacking up firewood, and hoping for the best. But Thomas was different. He had grown up in Norway, where the winters were as brutal as the land was unforgiving. He had seen men die from being unprepared, their cabins cracking under the pressure of snow and ice. It was something he couldn't forget, and something he refused to let happen again. By the time he had filed for his homestead in June of 1880, he knew exactly what he needed to do. While most of his neighbors hurried to build their cabins as quickly as possible, fast, simple, and cheap, Thomas took his time. He started by choosing a site tucked into a slight depression on his land, where the wind wouldn't hit the cabin directly. It wasn't the most convenient location, but it would offer protection from the biting winds that often swept across the prairie. Thomas spent months working on his cabin, but he wasn't just building shelter for himself. He was preparing for the animals, his horses. His barn wasn't like the others around the area. Where most settlers simply threw up a quick structure to store their feed and tools, Thomas built his barn with care and attention. He reinforced the walls, thickened the roof, and even added extra layers of insulation between the logs. But that wasn't the most important part. No, the most important part of Thomas's plan lay beneath the barn, hidden from the world. That fall, with the first signs of snow already on the ground, Thomas began work on a hidden hay tunnel concealed beneath the thick layer of straw and hay that lined the barn's floor. It wasn't much to look at, just a narrow, low tunnel that led deep into the hay where he could store feed for his horses. But it would serve a greater purpose soon enough. When the storm came, Thomas needed more than just the warmth of his cabin. He needed a way to keep his horses safe, to make sure they had enough food to survive the worst the winter could throw at them. And so, as the wind picked up and the first heavy flakes began to fall, Thomas Erickson knew one thing for certain. This winter was going to be different. The blizzard would come, and when it did, he would be ready. As the first signs of winter crept in, Thomas Erickson's neighbors were busy, just like him, preparing for the coming cold. But while they built quickly and cheaply, eager to finish their homesteads and start their farms, Thomas worked with a different mindset. He wasn't just preparing for another season, he was preparing for something far worse. His neighbors called him foolish. They saw the extra effort, the thicker logs, the added layers of insulation, and they laughed. They built their homes with speed, not care, and to them, Thomas's slow pace was a waste of time and money. He could have had his cabin finished in a few weeks like the others, but he was still working on it into late September. That's when William Crawford, a neighbor to the south, came by for a visit. "Still at it, eh, Erickson?" Crawford called from the edge of Thomas's property, shaking his head. "You're building a fortress, not a home." Thomas didn't stop. his work, but glanced up. "I'm building to survive, Crawford. A shelter's only as good as the storms it can weather." "Storms? You're planning for a hurricane or something?" "This is Dakota, not the Atlantic." Thomas said nothing. He knew better than to argue with someone who thought they knew it all. The truth was, Crawford and the others didn't understand the severity of the winters here. They'd seen mild years, with snow that didn't last long and cold that was manageable. But Thomas had seen the worst. Growing up in Norway, he had watched men freeze in their poorly built shacks, watched animals starve because their shelter wasn't enough. He wasn't going to make the same mistake. When Crawford left, still shaking his head, Thomas turned back to his work. He wasn't just building a home, he was ensuring survival. As he stacked logs for the barn, he recalled the lessons he had learned long ago. Always build for the worst you can imagine. It wasn't enough to just get by. You had to build with the knowledge that the prairie could kill if you didn't respect it. Every night after long days of work, Thomas would walk around the property, making sure every part of the barn and cabin was solid. He'd check the logs for gaps, make sure the roof was secure, and ensure the hidden hay tunnel was ready. The hay tunnel wasn't just a place to store feed, it was his contingency plan. If the storm came and he couldn't get out to the haystack, this tunnel would provide for his horses. The days were growing colder, the winds harsher. The storm, Thomas knew, was coming. He could feel it in his bones. But he was ready. And as he worked, he couldn't help but think of the neighbors who had mocked him. They thought he was crazy. But when the storm came, he knew who would survive. On October 15th, the weather shifted without warning. The first flakes of snow fluttered down in a gentle dance, hardly enough to make anyone worry. But Thomas knew better. He had been watching the sky for days, noticing how the wind had shifted to the northwest, how the clouds had grown darker and more menacing by the hour. It was coming. By noon, the snow had thickened and the winds began to pick up. A gust howled across the prairie, rattling the windows of Thomas's cabin and pushing the snow in all directions. He glanced out from the warmth of his kitchen, seeing the landscape blur as the storm built up speed. Thomas wasn't concerned for himself. He had built his cabin to withstand these kinds of storms, and the barn, reinforced with the extra logs and insulation, was far sturdier than the makeshift shelters his neighbors had hastily put together. But the storm was a different beast altogether. It wasn't just the cold, it was the intensity of the wind, the way it could bury you in an instant, turning the world into a white nightmare. He finished his last cup of coffee and stood up from the table, looking over the preparations he had made. The horses were in the barn, safe and warm, their feed ready in the hidden tunnel he had built beneath the hay. He had a small supply of food and firewood, enough to last for weeks if the storm kept up. He had taken every precaution. Outside, the storm picked up, snow swirling in a chaotic dance, thick enough now that Thomas could barely see past his own doorstep. The temperature plummeted quickly, the wind slashing at his face as he stepped outside. The air was cold enough to bite, and the visibility had dropped to nearly nothing. It was the kind of storm that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. As Thomas moved toward the barn, he glanced over his shoulder at the homesteads in the distance. The others had built quickly, without thought for the worst. His neighbors had ignored the warnings, thinking a heavy snowstorm was nothing to fear. But Thomas knew what could happen when a storm like this hit, and he knew it was only a matter of time before their cabins would start to show their weaknesses. He reached the barn door and opened it slowly, stepping inside. The warmth of the horse's breath filled the air, comforting in its familiarity. The barn was holding up well, as he knew it would. The horses seemed calm, oblivious to the fierce storm raging outside, but Thomas couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he wasn't done. He checked the hidden hay tunnel one last time, ensuring the feed was accessible and secure. The horses would be fine, but he needed to be prepared for the worst. The storm was only just beginning. The wind howled again, louder this time, and Thomas knew it was going to be a long, hard winter. 3 days into the blizzard, Thomas had lost track of time. The winds still howled outside, shaking the windows of his cabin and pushing the snow deeper into the cracks between the logs. He had no idea when the storm would let up. It was as if the earth itself had given up on the idea of spring. The prairie was a world of white, and all that existed now was the land, the storm, and the ranch. Inside the cabin, Thomas kept to his routine. The fire in the hearth crackled, sending warmth through the small room. He sat by the fire, his hands calloused and rough from years of labor, his eyes distant. The horses were tucked safely in the barn, fed and warm. His supplies were running low, but not dangerously so. He had prepared for this, or so he thought. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come, that the storm was just the beginning of something far worse. The silence in the cabin was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire or the gust of wind outside. The kind of silence that made you feel your own loneliness, even when you were surrounded by everything you needed. The horses were his only company. They didn't speak, didn't complain, just ate and moved when directed. But they were a reminder of his responsibility. He had promised to take care of them, to make sure they survived no matter what. In the barn, the hay tunnel was proving to be more than just a feeding station. It was a sanctuary. When the storm picked up, the horses had retreated into the tunnel, sensing the coming cold long before it arrived. They huddled together in the warmth of the hay, the tunnel providing not just food, but a shield from the biting wind outside. Thomas had built it as a precaution, not expecting it to be tested so soon. But now, as the snow piled up outside, he was grateful for it. For the first time in years, Thomas felt truly isolated. He had always been a man of solitude, someone who preferred the company of animals and the quiet of the land to the noise of civilization. But this was different. The storm felt like a wall, a barrier between him and the world he had known. The roads were impassable, the mail couldn't get through, and even if he wanted to go for help, the snow was too deep, the cold too fierce. He had no choice now but to wait for the storm to pass, for the snow to stop falling, for the sun to return, and all the while he'd keep the fire burning, tend to the horses, and pray that his preparations would be enough. The worst he knew was still to come. On the fourth day of the storm, Thomas stood by the window of his cabin, watching as the snow piled up higher with each passing hour. The world outside was unrecognizable, buried beneath a thick blanket of white. He hadn't seen anyone since the storm began, and the thought crossed his mind more than once. Had anyone else made it through? The storm had swept in quickly and violently, leaving no time for any of the homesteaders to properly prepare. Thomas knew he was one of the few who had anticipated something this fierce. He had heard it in the wind, seen it in the sky, and in the eyes of his horses as they instinctively knew to retreat to the warmth of the hay tunnel. He had done what he could for himself, but it wasn't just his own survival that weighed heavily on him. He thought of Peter Johnson, who lived 5 miles north. Peter was a stubborn man, one who had refused to take the winter seriously, always dismissing Thomas's warnings. Like most of the settlers around, he had built quickly, his cabin small and barely adequate for the harsh winters. Thomas could already imagine the struggles Peter and his family would face. His cabin wasn't well insulated, and he'd already run out of firewood. The blizzard, it seemed, was a reminder of how dangerous it could be to ignore the land. Thomas couldn't help but think of the others, too, all those who had cut corners in their construction, relying on their luck or hoping for a mild winter. He had no way of knowing if they were faring any better than Peter. His heart ached for them, but he couldn't risk leaving the barn for long. The horses needed him, and the hay tunnel, though hidden and secure, would only hold up for so long without careful attention. It wasn't long before the wind howled again, louder than before, almost as though the storm itself were calling to him. Thomas grabbed his coat, the warmth of the fire momentarily leaving his skin as he stepped outside. The air was biting, and the snow came down in dense sheets, nearly blinding him. It was impossible to see more than a few feet in front of him, but despite the risk, he had to make sure. He had to know if anyone was in trouble. He walked to the edge of his property, squinting into the storm. It was hopeless. There was no sign of movement, no trace of life beyond his barn. As he trudged further, the snow reached his knees. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he turned back to his cabin, Thomas was filled with a quiet dread. The storm was swallowing everything in its path, and in its wake, survival was going to be a brutal fight. His only hope now was that his preparation would carry him through, and perhaps offer the same to those he could reach. But he couldn't shake the feeling that some might not make it out. The storm stretched on without mercy, and Thomas Erikson remained a solitary figure in the heart of it. Days blended together in the relentless whiteout, each one indistinguishable from the last. The wind still screamed, unyielding, but the barn held strong. Inside, the horses huddled together, content and warm in the shelter Thomas had worked so carefully to create. But in the quiet moments, when he wasn't tending to his animals or stoking the fire, Thomas found his thoughts wandering back to his neighbors. He had checked his supplies and made sure the hay tunnel was secure, but every time he passed the window, he couldn't help but wonder how they were faring. The few he had seen building their cabins hurriedly seemed ill-prepared for what this storm had unleashed. The wind could turn even the most basic shelter into a trap. Peter Johnson, in particular, was on his mind. The man had been stubborn, always dismissing Thomas's warnings about the severity of the winters. Thomas had been patient with him, but there was only so much a man could do when the world decided to show its true power. Peter had been so sure that the storm would pass that he didn't need to go beyond the bare minimum. Now, Thomas couldn't help but wonder if Peter's wife and children were huddling together, trying to stay warm, perhaps in the same way he had seen animals shelter from the cold, fighting a battle they were destined to lose. The storm outside wasn't just cold, it was relentless, unforgiving. If the Johnson family had made it through the first couple of days, they might have been able to ride it out. But now, 4 days into the blizzard, things had changed. The snow was so thick it felt like the world had disappeared. Even the land he knew so well seemed foreign now, swallowed by the storm. Thomas stared at the barn door, the faint outlines of the horses visible through the snow-covered windows. He thought he had prepared well: a strong barn, a hidden hay tunnel, and enough supplies to last him weeks. But the storm was not just a test of resources, it was a test of endurance. It could wear a man down, isolate him until even the bravest heart began to question its own resolve. A faint sound reached his ears, a noise so small at first that it was barely noticeable. It was the sound of a sled scraping against the snow, the soft crunch of the runners over thick drifts. His heart quickened, and he moved quickly toward the barn door, squinting through the swirling storm. For a moment, the storm seemed to pause, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Then, through the heavy snow, he saw it. A figure, barely visible, struggling against the storm. It was too far to make out clearly, but Thomas knew who it was: Peter Johnson. The relief was short-lived. He wasn't alone, and he was coming from the direction of the homestead. Peter had made it, but barely. Thomas moved quickly to the barn door, opening it, just enough to let in a gust of snow. The wind lashed against his face as he stepped outside, squinting into the blizzard. His heart pounded in his chest. The figure was closer now, moving slowly, struggling against the wind. He could see the outline of Peter's sled, the weight of the snow forcing it down with every turn of the runners. "Peter!" Thomas called, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. Peter Johnson's head snapped up at the sound of his name, his face pale beneath layers of snow. His eyes were wide and his body hunched against the cold. It was clear he had been fighting the storm for longer than he'd intended. He was exhausted, battered by the wind, and moving slower with each step. Thomas stepped forward, his boots crunching through the snow. "Thomas," Peter said, his voice strained. I thought we wouldn't make it." Thomas didn't wait for Peter to finish. He motioned for him to follow and turned back toward the barn. Peter stumbled after him, leaning on the sled for support. The storm continued to howl, but the barn was a welcome sight, a refuge from the relentless cold. "Get inside, Peter," Thomas said, opening the door wider. "I've got shelter. You and your family can rest here." Peter collapsed into the warmth of the barn, and Thomas quickly shut the door behind them, sealing out the storm. The smell of hay and the warmth from the horses filled the air. Peter's eyes scanned the barn, and he looked at Thomas with disbelief. I don't know how you did it, Thomas," Peter muttered. "The storm. We've been trapped. I thought we wouldn't make it." Thomas motioned toward the hay tunnel. "It's not just shelter. The horses have been fine. The hay tunnel will keep us all alive, too." Peter looked at him, confusion in his eyes. "A hay tunnel?" Thomas nodded and walked toward the back of the barn, where the entrance to the hidden tunnel lay beneath the thick layers of hay. He pulled aside a bundle of dried straw and revealed the narrow opening. "You built this?" Peter asked, incredulity creeping into his voice. "I had to," Thomas said, as he knelt down and reached inside, pulling out a bundle of hay and setting it aside. He reached further in and removed more hay until they could both see the full extent of the tunnel. The space was small but well secured, just wide enough for the horses to move through, but not tall enough for a man to stand. It was a careful system that used the natural insulation of the hay to keep the temperature steady inside. A lifeline for both animals and people. "We can sleep here, stay out of the wind," Thomas said, his voice steady. "You'll be safe now." Peter looked at him, his gratitude clear. "You saved us, Thomas. We wouldn't have made it without you." Thomas nodded, his thoughts turning to the other neighbors, the ones still out there, fighting the storm. By the 6th day of the storm, the barn had become more than just shelter. It had become a refuge for the lost, a place of warmth and survival in a world turned cold. Peter Johnson and his family had settled in comfortably, the hay tunnel proving to be the safe haven it was intended to be. They had food, warmth, and each other. But outside, the storm raged on, and they were far from alone. Thomas could hear the wind howling louder as he stoked the fire, the crackle of burning wood, a steady rhythm in the otherwise silent barn. The horses were content, their breath fogging in the cool air as they stood in the hay tunnel, feeding. But something inside Thomas stirred, a sense of urgency that he couldn't shake. He had already heard rumors from his neighbors about the hardships they faced, but what was worse than any of them could have imagined was how quickly the storm had turned deadly. The knock on the door came without warning. It wasn't the familiar sound of a neighbor stopping by, nor the quiet knock of someone who needed assistance. This was louder, insistent, almost desperate. Thomas froze, his hand still on the firewood. His heart skipped a beat. No one should have been out in this storm. Peter, who had been sitting near the fire with his family, looked up with wide eyes. "Who could that be?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. Thomas didn't answer, his mind already racing. The last thing he needed was someone else to care for. The storm had taken its toll on everyone. Yet there was no question in his mind. He had to open the door. "Stay here," he said to Peter, his voice low. "Keep the fire going. Stay close." Slowly Thomas made his way to the door, his boots crunching against the snow beneath him. He moved quietly, trying to remain unseen, before he slowly cracked the door open just enough to peer outside. Through the thick swirl of snow, Thomas could just make out a figure stumbling toward the barn, barely visible. The wind had ripped through the prairie like a beast, and the storm had left nothing but a disorienting blur of white. But there was no mistaking it. The figure was coming toward him. With a deep breath, Thomas swung the door open wider. It was a woman, her face pale and covered with frost, her clothes caked in snow. She was barely able to stand, her eyes wide with terror. "Please," she gasped, her voice choked with cold. "Help me! Come inside," Thomas said, his voice steady but urgent. He reached out to steady her, helping her over the threshold and into the warmth of the barn. The storm had claimed yet another victim. The woman stumbled inside the barn, her breath ragged from exhaustion, her face frozen with the sting of the wind. Thomas gently helped her to the fire, where Peter had already risen from his seat, wide-eyed and filled with concern. He had seen the desperate look in the woman's eyes. She was clearly struggling, her body drained from the cold, but she was still alive, and that was something Thomas couldn't take for granted. "Let her sit by the fire," Thomas said, guiding the woman to a seat next to the warmth. She sank down with a sigh of relief, her hands shaking as she tried to remove the heavy layers of snow-covered clothing. Peter, still standing near the fire, looked at Thomas, then back at the woman. "Who is she?" "I don't know," Thomas said quietly, his gaze fixed on the woman. "But she's not from around here." The woman's teeth were chattering, and she couldn't speak at first, too winded from her struggle to find shelter. Thomas could see the fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that came from being alone in a storm, fighting to survive. She wasn't used to this kind of isolation, but the world had changed in the past few days, and no one could afford to be unprepared. "Water?" she finally rasped, her voice barely audible. "Please." Peter hurried to fill a mug, handing it to her. She drank greedily, her hands trembling as she held the mug to her lips. "Where did you come from?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but firm. "You're not from around here, are you?" The woman's eyes flickered up to meet his, a mix of fear and relief crossing her face. "No," she said after a moment, her voice hoarse. "I'm from the north, a few miles from here. I couldn't make it. The storm, it was too much. My family." She choked, tears welling in her eyes. "My family didn't make it." Thomas felt his heart twist. He knew the brutal reality of this storm all too well. The land could claim anyone, and in an instant, everything could be lost. "We'll get you warm," Thomas said gently, moving to stoke the fire. He had no answers for her grief, no way to fix what the storm had taken, but he knew what was within his power. He could offer her shelter, food, and warmth. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Peter moved to the hay tunnel, gathering more blankets and passing them to Thomas, who laid them over the woman's shivering body. The warmth of the fire slowly seeped into her, but the toll of the storm had left its mark. "We'll stay here, together," Thomas said, his voice steady. "We'll make it through, all of us." Outside, the storm raged on, but within the barn there was a flicker of hope. In the harshest of winters, the test of survival was more than just food or shelter. It was about holding on to something, even if it was just each other. The storm finally broke on the 7th day, though its fury still lingered in the fierce wind. The snow began to slow, and by morning the world outside had transformed into a blinding, snow-covered wilderness. The barn stood strong, a small fortress amid the desolation. Inside, Thomas, Peter, and the woman whose name was Annabelle had managed to survive. It wasn't the life they'd hoped for, but it was life. Thomas sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, the warmth a comfort after days of biting cold. Annabelle was still resting in the hay tunnel, recovering from the toll the storm had taken on her. Peter sat nearby, looking out the barn window at the vast white landscape, his face drawn with exhaustion and relief. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy. They were all waiting, unsure of what to do next. The storm had ravaged everything it could, and now all they could do was survive until it passed. Annabelle was the first to stir, sitting up slowly from her bed of hay and blankets. She winced, but the pain in her muscles seemed to be less than before. She caught Thomas watching her and gave him a tired but grateful smile. "You've saved us," she said softly, her voice still hoarse from the cold. "I don't know how we can ever repay you." Thomas shook his head. "No need for repayment. You're alive, and that's enough." Peter stood and walked over to Thomas, his eyes still distant but filled with understanding. "We'll make it through, Thomas. I know we will. You've got a way of seeing what others miss." Thomas didn't respond. He wasn't looking for praise. He had done what had to be done, and there was still a long road ahead. His thoughts drifted to his neighbors, to the other settlers who had been caught in the storm. How many hadn't made it? How many would never see spring? The thought haunted him. "Do you think anyone else made it through?" Peter asked quietly, reading the troubled look on Thomas's face. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. He wished he had an answer, but the truth was that the storm had been unforgiving. Even with all his preparations, he wasn't certain anyone else had fared better than Annabelle and her family. The door to the barn creaked, and they all looked up. A figure stood in the doorway, half hidden by the snowstorm still swirling outside. It was hard to make out at first, but the shape was unmistakable. "Thomas?" came the faint voice, weak but recognizable. "Crawford?" Thomas muttered, rising to his feet. The neighbor, William Crawford, was standing there, shivering and snow-covered, his face haggard. He had made it. But how many others hadn't? Without a word, Thomas stepped forward and helped him inside, ready for whatever came next.